It's like story from 20s. It's like historical overview of Ukrainian film industry in 20s. But this story is very relevant to like our days geopolitical stuff and war in Ukraine. I mean, I didn't have much time to create like perfect PowerPoint presentations, so those of you who are very sensitive to artistic deviation, just like be strong. Just like brief, what? I mean, the guy just like broke everything. Just like a brief remarks. So like Soviet Union was created in 1920. I just like so bad. Okay, maybe it's better like when you see like the full text, not just like. So like the Soviet Union was created. There were 4 republics in the beginning, like Ukrainian, Russian, Belarus, and Transcaucasian. Principles like equality were declared, or was declared like this particular principle. They have like common stuff, common administration regarding like military, management, armed forces, economy and budget, but they were like independent in cultural terms, so autonomous in cultural terms. So every republic was responsible for doing its own culture. I still need to have. So it's like very important. And this was like written in the Constitution of 1924, before Stalin. Okay, so it's like unknown guy almost for everyone. Muhammad Kapchinsky, he was like alumnus of Kiev University, and I'm starting from 1925. And he was like one of the first heads of Odessa Film Factory. They're like actually studios, but they call them factory to sound more like industrial oriented. And later on, he became known as the first head of Gaskino Film Factory, which later became Mosfilm Factory in Moscow. And why did like Russia need Ukrainian crisis managers? Because like Russian film industry was really bad. Like in the beginning of 20s, there were too many foreign films and like few competitive Russian films on the market. This issue was discussed on like top levels in Kremlin among like high politicians, and they decided to ask help or to engage into process like experienced managers from even different republics, even Ukraine. So they invited him to Moscow to like govern this Gaskino Film Factory, the first state film factory in Moscow, 1925. In Ukraine, everything started in 1922, like 3 years earlier. So he came to Moscow and got his first governmental contract. He was supposed to make a like huge film dedicated to anniversary of 1905 revolution. And it's like they have, I think, 6 months. The scale was like, you can read, it's gonna be like super blockbuster Soviet film. The scale was like huge. They wanted to show it like in different places, like across Soviet Union. I think it's like Sebastopol in okay, don't judge me for that. And like the film, this like the major screening or the opening screening were scheduled to be like in Kremlin in Moscow. That's all this like officials guy. And there were like too many ambitions, but like no time for doing this stuff. No director was like ready to sacrifice himself to engage into this project, and Kapchinsky found one Jewish Russian director who was like young enough and crazy enough to take this job, and they started to shoot across the country, but like from St. Petersburg. But the weather was bad, and film industry like relates have a good weather, and nice weather and sun. So Kapchinsky decided to move all shooting to Odessa, and just like neglect all these like episodes and focus primarily on Odessa story. And do you have any idea what film I'm talking about? And this is like Battleship Potemkin, the film, like one of the major films of Soviet film industry. So some of you might at least like heard about Battleship Potemkin, but I'm sure no one heard about Mikhail Kapchinsky and Ukrainian film industry in 20s. And since you're just like illustrating my point that Soviet film industry, like Soviet film history was written in Moscow like later during 30s and 40s, written from like Moscow perspective. And this like hegemonic Russian view was retranslated by like almost all foreign scholars, because a lot of them didn't like know how to like, they didn't speak Ukrainian, for example. So they had to like retranslate what was written in Russian center perspective. I mean, I was in University College of London a couple of years ago, and there's a guy who wrote like one of the canonical book on Soviet film industry. He knows nothing about that as well. And I mean, Soviet, what I want to say, so like Soviet film history, like Soviet history in general, usually ignores like the diversity of different Soviet republic existed during that time, and neglecting public cultural and aesthetic and political diversity, different versions and notions of socialist culture and socialist projects. So Ukrainian socialist culture is completely different from Russian socialist culture. It's completely different from Armenian or Georgian socialist culture. There were like majority of like diversity of different types of culture. And the war we have now, it's like partially starts from this time. So I'm going to talk about VUFKU, which is all Ukrainian film administration. It's like very easy, it's state monopoly basically. So, and like VUFKU existence like coincides with two very important like politics or policy, Ukrainization and new economic policy. You might heard about this stuff. So, or you can just read it briefly. It's like was very important for successful like development of Ukrainian film industry. So, so it was created in March 13, 1922. It's like 100 years anniversary this year, this March actually. And 3 points I want to stress is that it became like the most successful state monopoly in film industry of Soviet Ukraine, and like partially even on general level of Soviet Union. It was like one of the most successful cases of international collaboration back in Ukraine, and became like interdisciplinary cultural platform back home, which like unite different people from different like representative of different arts, different like cultural elites under this like cinematic umbrella. So like state monopoly, VUFKU controls 3 film studios in Yalta, Odessa, and Kiev. Like Yalta was like annexed. There's still like people still fighting for Odessa and Kiev right now. And VUFKU was like called Ukrainian Hollywood by I just like forgot his name. I will come back to it later. So it was like a state monopoly. They controlled like all links of distribution from like film process, just like from production, distribution, education, like propaganda, advertisement. They had like their own newspapers and magazines and like different like representatives around Ukraine, across Ukraine. So it's just like a give you idea. It's like 1925. It's VUFKU, Yalta, just like people working there. It's Odessa film studio. It still exists. It's just like a small scale version of it. And it's like Kiev film studio. Now it's named after Alexander Dovzhenko. They started to build it in 1927 after there was like an earthquake in Yalta, and they had to move their facilities from Crimea to Kiev, and it was like huge. It became one of the most like modern, up-to-date film factories in Europe. And like this, the first pavilion was like of soccer field size. I'm not sure if you're familiar with like soccer fields, but it's like 100. I mean, you're not familiar with meters. I mean, it's like 100 meters. It's huge, and it's still there and it still like operates. So it's like just a brief statistics. Like number of employees, it managed to increase like many times from 1923 to 1929. Film feature production. So we have like earthquake in Yalta. That's why they started to produce film in Kiev. But altogether, VUFKU existed from like 1922 till 1929-30, and they made like more. It's not like right statistics right now. It's like more of 140 feature films, and like couple of hundreds newsreels, documentaries. It's hard to like just find them because all of them are destroyed. It's easy like to trace feature films, but it's like a lot. And just to give you like idea of costs of the film, it's like October by the same Sergei Eisenstein, made in Moscow. It cost like 800,000 rubles, and it's like the most expensive Ukrainian film. Taras Shevchenko, it was like the first biopic about like Ukrainian traditional romantic poet, and it was like 3 hours long, very boring and painful, but it's like explains somehow the costs like used for create this film. And it's like Earth by Dovzhenko, also like very famous Ukrainian film, and when with the movie came, it's just very modest amount of money, but it's considered, it was like recognized like a couple of years ago by British Film Institute as like one of the best documentary films ever made. So VUFKU had this like very interesting economic model, which is actually like reminds a lot model in early like Hollywood years. They didn't have much state support. They didn't spend like so much money on propaganda like Russians did during that time. Just like also they increased almost in 7 times cinema theaters presence, like from 300 to like 2,000. It was like a lot. It was just like after the civil war or like revolution, but they managed to like recreate and reconstruct industry from 1922 till like 25 almost completed. They didn't have like much personnel, but I will come back to it later. Okay, so VUFKU was very active on international market because of tensions with Moscow on like local Soviet market. VUFKU was so successful, they controlled almost third part of the Soviet Union market. Well, it was like 3 times smaller than Russian state film industry, and they created some tensions later in 20s. So they immediately started to cooperate with different producers of film equipment and film stock. They had contracts with like Kodak, Pathé, Zeiss, it's like German one. Art Kino Debris, French. This American film distributor of Soviet films. They like emerged in 1925 after actually watching Battleship Potemkin in New York and somewhere like in some private apartment, and they like distributed Soviet films afterwards. And they started to sell Ukrainian films abroad. So it was like normal stuff for Ukrainian films. You'd be seen in Paris, London, Berlin, Warsaw, Prague, Toronto, Tokyo, New York. Sometimes the premiere was like happened first in New York than in Moscow because they have like very intense relationship Russia. They have international reporters around the globe in Europe, USA, and Canada. Eugène Deslave, which became like a French avant-garde film director, and if you like fly to New York and visit MoMA, they have his films in permanent exposition. They call like Electric Nights and March of the Machines. They invited, being like very successful institution, cultural institution, relatively rich institution in Soviet Ukraine, they were able to invite like foreign personnel, the cameraman, like artists, directors. Cameraman, they like invite a whole bunch of German cameramans, because Germany produced like Zeiss optics, which was like standard of quality back then, and a lot of German like cameramen worked in Ukraine. Yeah, they like participated in international exhibitions and like art fairs and cultural fairs. It's like a poster, Sharks of New York, made by Alexander Dovzhenko back then. These are two Ukrainian silent films about like Cossacks, Terrestrial Silence, like psychological drama inside a family during the Civil War, when like son on like fighting for Bolsheviks, and father is just still under whites, but then they kill his son. They decided to burn them like down. it's 3 days from the life of like the father, and this like psychological and political transformation and metamorphosis to like political engaged subject. So the first film got into North American distribution in United States in 1927 and 1928. So it was like many years ago. This was like my favorite one. They were like quite aware of like all trends in arts in like modern art in Europe and like elsewhere. So it's like, what if Taras Bulba, and it's like a novel by Mykola Gogol, who is also like a Ukrainian-born writer who wrote about Ukraine, but still like annexed by Russian culture for some reason. So what if like Taras Bulba being made by like Hollywood film industry, and you see like kind of melodrama romantic iris here on the kiss, German like expressionist, very like crazy geometrical form, French avant-garde, Georgian film industry. This is like it's amazing. It's like Sovkino, which is like Russian interpretation of Ukraine, and you see like guy just like dancing and singing. It was like became a prevalent interpretation of representation of Ukrainian culture like later in 30s of Ukraine as like pre-modern, apolitical, non-urban, kind of exoticized folkloric culture. And this is like VUFKU image of their adaptation of Taras Bulba. So for them, like social emancipation and national liberation come together. And it's like differs. I mean, it's what was different about Ukrainian culture compared to Russian culture. Like social and national issue always come together. Okay, it's just like so weird aspect ratio. So due to the lack of like resources and like professionals, they were forced to like open the doors to a lot of different people. They like cultural politics was like personal policy was very inclusive. They invited people of different political, social like background. So Yurko Titunik, like a former officer of an anti-Soviet army, worked for them. Alexander Dovzhenko, who worked for Ukrainian National Republic Army, came to work for them. Like pre-revolutionary film director, German like cinematographer Josef Rona, who worked with Alexander Dovzhenko, Vladimir Mayakovsky, like Russian poet, came to VUFKU. I will talk about it. Like Ukrainian futurist poet, like Mikhail Semenko, Mike Yoganson. Sculpture photographers, like theatrical directors, all kind of different peoples. And actually, it's like inclusivity, diversity, and openness to experiments. Like that's what makes like VUFKU history unique in Soviet time. Like Alex Kurbas, like theatrical film director, organized Brazil theater in Kharkiv. And if you follow news, you like unfortunately know what's going on in Kharkiv right now. So he had his labs, design studio, and he was very successful both on theater and in cinema, because like cinema was contemporary art during that time. It was like people just go to work in cinema, people can be paid more, and it was like modern, urban, and experimental art. So he like studied in Vienna, studied philosophy in Vienna. So all of them were like had close ties and links with European modernism during that time. Yeah, that's how his theater stage looked like. It's actually Jimmy Higgins by Upton Sinclair, who is American, and you can see just like American flag right now. So they like moved away from realistic representation to like constructivist, rhythmic, very modern, Brecht influenced kind of stage performance. And there are a bunch of Brazilian like actors who came to Ukrainian cinema to work in Ukrainian cinema. And Amroci Buchmann is like one of the like canonical pictures of Ukrainian artists. It's from Dovzhenko's Arsenal. So like a lot of people from like literature came to work in cinema, like pan-futurist, Ukrainian version of futurist movement. Almost all like guys were there. What they did, they like translate intertitles, for example, foreign films. They worked as editors, script writers. They like wrote film critics. All like there are like bunch of Ukrainian film futurists, and they're all like heavy smokers, as you can see, but they're all like very young. Bajan was 29 when he became a head of like Kino magazine. It's like a actual journal, magazine dedicated to cinema, and was published by VUFKU and had like crazy layout design, and it was like very popular. So in 29 he was the head of like all Ukrainian magazine, a journal dedicated to film industry. It's like, can you imagine like right now someone like 21 doing something similar? And he wrote a script for like it's Alim from 1926. It was shot in Yalta in Crimea. It was like the first. Actually, the VUFKU made a lot of film dedicated to like emancipation of different minority and groups, like national minorities. Like they had a bunch of film dedicated to women, like emancipation. This film was dedicated to Crimean Tatar emancipation, so it was made like actually one of it's the first and maybe the last one. A film dedicated to Crimean like emancipation during Soviet time. Mike Yoganson wrote a script for Dovzhenko's Vinegar. It's like one of the first Ukrainian like silent films, like Mayakovsky. So he signed a contract to write like 10 scripts. He only managed to produce 2 of them. And it's like Troye and Oktябрюхов, Dekabryu, it's like about 3 guys from different class background and how they came together and became like proper Soviet citizens. And Oktябрюхов and Dekabrюхов, it's hard to translate. It's like December and October, just like 2 brothers. One of them escaped during the revolution, one stayed. Both of this film survived, and we have it like back home in Dovzhenka Center in State Film Archive. Okay, so it's like graphic artists. They came to work at VUFKU as well, like Vasil Khrushchevsky, like painter, architect, one of the like father founders of National Academy of Fine Arts in Architecture in Kiev in 20s, and they created a really nice like environment there. A lot of prominent and progressive people taught there. For example, like Kazimir Malevich, who was also born in Kiev, like taught in Kiev National Academy of Fine Arts. He was like he worked on Taras Shevchenko like film production as a set designer. Just like the most expensive Ukrainian film I will mention. Is the guy. It's like Dovzhenka in German cameraman. It's like a set of this vinegar film. Moreover, he was like a very popular person during the struggle for independence and during this like so-called civil war. So it's his design actually. So he designed like coat of arms, state seal, paper currency, like hryvnia and like trizub. So it's just like very different but great people who worked for film industry in 20s in Ukraine, and they like made a lot of like crazy and psychedelic posters for Ukrainian Soviet films. Just like show you a couple of them. It's like Vasilina, it's like another women emancipation film. And they like did intertitles for film. So it was a real art to create different intertitles for like different kind of film. Russian is dying. I put it here on purpose. And apart from what also like make VUFKU so special in the Soviet Union context, they made a lot of genre films, not just like high art, avant-garde films. So they really followed like the Hollywood model and the public appeal that I try to create. So they like shoot comedies. It's like Self-Seeker film made in 1929. It's about a guy from Kiev who traveled around the country like on a camel during like the civil war and like find himself in a very like awkward situation. This reds, whites. It's like a genre. It's like iconic film of this women emancipation block. It's about like love of Ukrainian soldier and Chechen girl. He brought her back home and finds that not like Ukrainian people in villages are super tolerant to different like ethnic groups. A lot of films dedicated to like children and made especially for children. One of the prominent film director who like became the main film director specialized in children of, is it like children's cinema or how do you call it, like what is the proper name? I mean, like do you have kind of like a hashtag or genre for it? There was a guy Axel Lundin, the guy who was born in like in Sweden, then came to Ukraine, started to work and became like prominent. This is like my favorite one. It's they even made like peplums. It's like very Hollywood genre about like ancient times, like Greek Rome's. So they made like Spartacus, and they made it in Odessa, so you can see like pictures from shots in Odessa. And Ilfi Petrov, if you heard about the guys who wrote like 12 chairs, like kind of very good like stand-uppers and comedians of that time. They were living in Odessa during that time, like depicting like guys walking in togas in Odessa city center. But after film came out, it was like bad, and Ilfi Petrov wanted to ask, like, I mean, they wrote some kind of a feuilleton, like a small like anecdotal genre, to ask Neron to burn down Odessa because that film is so bad. And it was made by Turkish film director Ertuğrul Muhsin Bey, who also was invited by VUFKU, came to Ukraine to make films there. But so it was like a bit about like genre blog, but Ukrainian film industry became like known internationally and acclaimed because of like Alexander Dovzhenko, Dziga Vertov, and Ivanka Valeridze, and they were like avant-garde artists. So I'm like talk a bit about like avant-garde, this experiment of Ukrainian film industry. As you can see, they're also very young. This is like Alexander Dovzhenko, this is his wife. So Dovzhenko, before he came to work at VUFKU, he studied, for example, in Berlin. He worked in Warsaw in Germany as like diplomatic representative, but he started to like a poster artist. So it's like in the clothes of Soviet. It's like struggle of giants. So it's like his posters he made before he came like film director. He started to make comedies, and he wanted to be like Ukrainian Buster Keaton of that time, but then he created 3 Ukrainian films like Zvenigora, Arsenal, and The Earth, which are known as like Dovzhenko Silent Trilogy. It's like the most popular and famous internationally acclaimed Ukrainian silent films. Wait a second, I will try not to lose. Okay, and Dovzhenko is known like a father of Ukrainian poetic cinema. So Zvenigora, it was 1927, 1929, 1930. Zvenigora was made as a kind of version of try to compress 1,000 years of Ukrainian history into like one film. It's a very weird and poetic film. And after its release, Zvenigora was like claimed to be the first Ukrainian like film. We had a film industry, but we have no Ukrainian films, like critics claimed. And it was the first film to be national in form and socialist in content. It was like doctrine on which like Ukrainization, this like Ukrainization campaign was based. And in 1928, it was screened in Paris for the first time, and later, during the same year, it represented Ukraine together with Dziga Vertov, the film 11th Year, in Netherlands, like film fair in Gag, also a very nice place from nowadays perspective. So he made Arsenal about like Bolshevik struggle, but he made it so unintelligible and complex. People just like complain a lot, and it became like the most unintelligible film of this period. But it was mentioned by American National Board of like Film Review as one of the in top 5 like best films of 1929. And he like made Earth in 1930. It's like the most controversial film of Ukrainian silent history. It's like a basic idea. It's like about collectivization. Tractors coming into village, and people were just like happy. But what happened? So tractors came into the village, and it ran out of water into its cooler, and it stopped. And the guy decided to like urinate in this like radiator and cooler, and Stalin was mad about it because like tractor is a symbol of collectivization, industrialization of Soviet Union, and you can't treat like tractors like that. Even though it wasn't Russian tractor, Russian didn't produce tractors till like 1932. It was American tractors made by Ford. So it's very interesting combination. Yeah, and like famous Dziga Vertov, famous trio of brothers, David, Mikhail, and Boris Kaufman. They were born in Poland in Jewish family, but after the First World War started, they moved to Kiev. And like Boris Kaufman, the youngest one, I mean, he's from Other story, he has moved to France when he was like literally young, and then the United States, where he like Oscar awarded cinematographer made, for example, 12 Angry Men with Sidney Lumet in the 50s, so he was cinematographer. Other two brothers stayed in Ukraine. David, who later became known as Zyga Vertov, studied music and math, and Mikhail is a guy who actually was a cameraman. He's was a tech geek, or how do you call it? He was obsessed with photo cameras and film cameras. He was improving them constantly. But he worked as a mechanic in garage for some part of his life. So Vertov was invited to work in Moscow in 1916 when he and then in 1916 he started to sign his poems as Zyga Vertov, which is Zyga in Ukrainian mean spinning toy. That's Ukrainian originated nickname. And Vertov also means spin, so it's a kind of very strange constellation. So he was invited to Moscow, but Mikhail Koltsov, who was later editor of Pravda and Ogonyok magazines, but who was also from Odessa, so he invited him to work in Moscow, at Moscow in film studios. But Vertov was very rebellious. He didn't want to write scripts for his films. In 1927, he was just kicked. He was too experimental for Moscow during that time. He was just kicked out from Moscow, and VUFKU, of course, just invited Vertov and Kaufman kind of back home, and Vertov made 3 films in Ukraine, Kaufman made 2 films in Ukraine, but they made it not average films. They started a movement called Kinoki. Okay, I will try to do it fast. Movement called Kinoki, futurist-oriented, modern, anti-realistic, anti-traditional art. So it's from their manifesto from 1922 called V. Keep away from traditional arts. Keep away from them. They're mortally contagious. So it was the kind of traditional manifesto. And yeah, just to illustrate how kind of rebellious they are, just during the shooting of anti-tobacco advertisement film. So Vertov, the first film Vertov made in Ukraine was 11th years, it was poster for Russian distribution. It was in Russian about industrialization, Dnipro gas, which is in Zaporizhia, construction. It's supposed to be dedicated to 10 years of revolution. He made it in 1927, but he again he called it 11th year because he doesn't like all this anniversary hysteria. So he made Men with the movie camera in Kiev, Odessa, and Kharkiv, not in Moscow. How a lot of scholars recognize Moscow in that film, which is not true. And he also made he also made the first sound Soviet film in 1930. They're miners in the Donetsk region called Enthusiasm, the Symphony of the Donbass. It was made in 1930, the first sound Soviet films ever made. Mikhail Kaufman, his brother, made In Spring in 1929, one of my favorite films about Kiev. It's Japanese poster of the film. It's just urban symphony, very poetic, very experimental and avant-garde, with no narration, with no language, with no intertitles. Just appeal directly to your emotions. Japanese poster. And after the watching of this film, one of the guy from VUFKU administrative board said something like that: if I was presiding over a suicide club, I would have closed the shop and have no clients left. It was a really nice film, and we are trying to organize a screening of In Spring in Buskirk Chimney Theater. So if you're interested, just follow. And the final guy is Ivanka, the Georgian origin, born in Ukraine but of Georgian descent. He was a sculptor back then, well-known sculptor. He made first European constructivist like large-scale monument of Artyom. It's in Bakhmut in the Donetsk region. It's like Svetohirsk in the same region. This one still stands as for now there. It's like protected by UNESCO. This one was destroyed by German soldier. It's like 30 meters high. I mean, at least meters, just like people. So it's like it's huge. This one was destroyed by Nazi during the Second World War. They didn't manage to destroy like the whole like postament, just this monument. How do you say it? Like, just like this guy, but it was made of concrete, which is like very solid material. He also made first post-revolutionary monument dedicated to Taras Shevchenko, and this monument to Taras Shevchenko in Poltava he made later. You never just like unique Taras Shevchenko, especially for Ukrainian like realistic representation tradition. And he made his first films Downpour. After he made his film, critics claimed that Arsenal, which was, as I said, like proclaimed to be like the most unintelligible film ever, the critics said, okay, like now Arsenal is clear and transparent compared to this. So all his films were like super static. He made it in like against velvet background, dark. Like film didn't survive, but he made two other like Perikop and Storming Nights, like also experimental avant-garde film, and they became like a main target of Stalinist anti-formalist campaign in 1936. In his, I'm just like I finished already. So in 1936, like Pravda magazine published like his famous article, anti-formalistic article on his film Prometheus, was like blamed to be like the worst film in terms of the worst enemy of social realism. In his films, he gave like voice to different Ukrainian ethnical groups. So in his films, actually like Polish or like Ukrainian or Jews speak like in their own languages, while like it was not proper during in 30s when like Russian language is proclaimed to be like the real language. It's fine because like Stalin talked with Georgian accent till like 90. I mean like I think it's like 1931, but in later films he speaks like in fluent Russian. So it's like it's a very important shift. So VUFKU independence, like in the late 20s, became the main economical and artistic challenge for Moscow Sovkino, which wanted to control and govern all other film organizations. Like nothing changes from that time. It was said by Mykola Skripnik, Ukrainian People's Commissar of Education, who was very supportive of Ukrainian film industry. He was born in Bakhmut, where you've seen this Artyom monument. And in 1933, he like committed suicide after VUFKU was like disbanded. And it's like I found this picture in actually it's like his actual picture in archive, because like people were very anxious to remove all traces of like traitors from like newspapers and magazines. And VUFKU was blamed of being like the center of bourgeois national culture and was subordinated and like the central body in Moscow. That's when Ukrainian film industry and culture was his autonomy, and it was like the first clear violation of Soviet Constitution of 1924. Yeah, that's basically what I wanted to say for now, and it's still like relevant because I've worked for like 10 years, been working at Dovzhenko Center, which is a state film archive, and which was like created in 1994 when Ukraine became independent. And what happened when we started to like, I wasn't there in 1994, but there were like no Ukrainian films left in Ukraine. It became, according to like all Soviet Union policy, all film produced in national republics were taken to the store in Russia, in like Gosfilmofond and Belые Stolby, next to Moscow. So we had film copying factory. There were 6 film copying factories in Soviet Union. We had 2 of them in Ukraine. And the Dovzhenko Center was like based on the premises of film copying factories. That's why we had like core of thousands of Ukrainian films. Now we like enrich it to 7,000 names, but we are not like, there are a bunch of Ukrainian films still in Moscow. We're buying them. There is no like repatriation program. We're buying Ukrainian film from Moscow for like since 1994, which is like ridiculous. That's why we started to look elsewhere, knowing that like VUFKU distributed a lot of Ukrainian films around the globe. And we found like Ukrainian films in Bundesarchiv in Germany, in I-Archive in Amsterdam, in like Poland, United Kingdom, like United States, in Paris. One of our latest discoveries, documentary, like scientific documentary from 1930s called Man and the Ape. We found it in Tokyo Film Archive. So that's very interesting, and I mean all these tensions and problems are rooted back in the very interesting period of 1920s. I just like try to talk you about a bit. Yeah, thanks. I wanted to show you like a video clip just to give you like an idea how it was, how interestingly mad it was, like psychedelic was it. But for some reason they have no like drivers here, and I may try. Yeah. Okay, let's get. Okay. I can show you on my laptop because it's like I found this. It is a trailer made in 1927 for Ziga Vertov's 11th year, and I found it in Amsterdam, and like from private collectioner, and we get it, and it's like 2 minutes long. It's not too long.
Do you want to try to hook up your laptop to the HD?
But I have like USB-C, and they have like HDMI, and I just like. But I mean, you can come closer.
Yeah.
And so in Ukrainian, which is uncommon, because later in searches they just cut out all Ukrainian intertitles. It was easy to cut out intertitles and like crucify films. So it was made by motion graphic department of VUFKU. It's like 1927. It's not. Yeah, so it's like basically.